Hello and welcome to another Alternative Interactions. I'm Gary. Welcome aboard. Now today we're going to be looking at mud floods, and it's going to be kind of a beginner's guide to what are mud floods, because I'm sure many of you have come across people talking about the mud floods and Tartaria, and we will get onto Tartaria again next time probably, or in the future, but today we're concentrating on mud floods. Now, mud floods are when we get something called, in the technical term, mud liquefaction. And what that means is basically is we get a vibrational frequency, and there's that vibrational frequency again, going through the earth at such a resonance that it turns the solid ground, or the mud or the sand, not bedrock, but mud, sand, gravel, whatever, and it turns that into a liquid fundamentally. And this effect often also has the undesirable effect of creating volcanoes and such like. And so if we were to have a cataclysm or a modern reset as such, we would have a vibrational frequency that would turn the ground unsolid, and we would also potentially have volcanoes, and so we would have a huge amount of volcanic ash coming down over a period of weeks afterwards, potentially. Not very nice, not very pleasant, I should imagine, to live through, but we have evidence that this has happened all over the world, and it's not just where I live in the UK, but America, global. And so we have had resets which have affected different parts of the world, not necessarily all at the same time. We're not necessarily talking about an Adam and Eve reset as such, but we are talking about issues that happened. So what I've done is I've provided a slideshow. I'm going to talk you through the slideshow on how to spot a mud flood building and what we can expect to see from a mud flooded building. And we'll also go into the age of buildings potentially that are mud flooded that you would see or perhaps even live in without realizing that you're living in a building that has been mud flooded. So let's go and do the technical stuff, which is terrible at. So here we go. Display capture. And okay. Now hopefully you are seeing a church or cathedral. I think it's a church from The Hague. Now the blue lines and the red line and the yellow dotted line across the bottom doesn't seem very significant at the moment, but here we have an image, a painting from the 17th century. Again, it looks muddy even on the floor there, which is strange. Not a great flooring, but we have a lovely image. Now if we go to a second image of the same building around and it's in 1655, we can see that we have a very similar type building. But what we have on the yellow line this time is the ground level in 2017. So this building, if I go back, here I think is a later date than the first one that we see, because I think what we're seeing is some of the Tartarian free tech that's been removed from the top of the church. But fundamentally we're looking at the same building. You can see it's the same building. Yeah. So we can then go to a modern photograph and we can see quite clearly that the front has changed immensely. And this line here that we see is the modern day line, and what we have is a third of that church is actually under the ground now. So this church, at some point after it was painted twice in The Hague, has sunk into the ground, or there has been material deposited on top that has affected that. And if you want to go back in the video and rewind it, we also see that there's a height difference in these buildings to the side as well. Now this is a church in England. I can't imagine why you would go to the effort of building a church with a great big stained glass window under the ground, half submerged under the ground, and yet here we can clearly see that it is. We can see here that this would not have been the original level of the ground, and I would say that a third of this material is either from mud liquefaction where it's come up, and or in conjunction with ash that's fallen from somewhere in the past. Now this I would say is probably a Russian building, because in Russia we get an awful lot of very much mud flooded events, and the Russians in recent years have actually been digging them out. So what we see here by the crane is the street level currently, and what they have done, and you can see the street level, look, and what they have done is they have actually dug down into the original level that was the ground level at the point before the mud flood happened. And I'm not going to say when I think the mud flood happened. There's plenty of conjecture at the moment, and I probably will go on to that later date, but we can see evidence of this building being dug out and us having windows and doorways that were under the ground. And here we have plenty of examples of a current street level with windows that are half buried. Now in this one here on the top right hand side, you can see that we have the top of the windows, and what you'll notice is we often get these later additional steps going into what would have been the second floor, and we can see this very clearly that this is was originally would have been the street level, and here we go along here and we can see it fairly clearly. It's consistent. Now this is the British History Museum in London, and we can see that we have a big row of windows which would have been very, very deep windows, all at street level and tiny. Look at the amount of material here above the windows. That indicates to me that these would have been very long, probably a double height Georgian heighted window, and now we just see a tiny little window and all this facade around it, which does not make sense at all. This building here, you can clearly see that there is a stairway going up to doors, whether this was a window or it's been rebuilt. They've probably dug out the bottom part here, put that doorway up here, created a set of steps, and then dug out just around the window so that they could then use the basement as either a flat basement room or such like, just to give a little bit of light in. But we see this quite commonly. And again, this is a Russian building, I believe, and we can clearly see that we had the street level going along here, and they've dug it out, and there we are. We have windows, probably a doorway, the original doorway perhaps here, or this was the original doorway in this corner here that has now been bricked up. Now this is on my travels. I came across this village in Norfolk, and what we have is clearly we have a very old building, and we have a metal grate, and the window continues down below. And this is a typical mud flood property in the UK. This is it further back. The mud flood building actually that I've photographed is here, and upon walking down the street I noticed this. Now this is actually a front door and a big window, a big entranceway, and railings and steps down. And if I take the photograph here from the railings, you can clearly see the steps down, a door and the window. Now this would have been the original level of the street. And if we go back, you can clearly see just how much higher that is. And we see this across all of Norfolk in East Anglia, as well as London, and I should imagine up north as well. Now this is London, and we can see later date steps going up to the second floor, and this is the original level that's been dug out to create flats. Most of these buildings, and again we have another one, secondary steps going up to the second floor. That was probably a window of some sort, and they've just shoved a square lintel in, and thank you very much. And then they've cut a doorway through here underneath the steps to get access into the bottom. Now in England we had in Great Yarmouth, there's a lady called Kathy. CM is the name of her channel now, and I will be sharing her channel on here. The channel's actually called @JacksFan, but she's changed the name. And Kathy is a solicitor, and she does conveyancing in the UK in the ward of Great Yarmouth. And the information that she's come up with is absolutely fascinating, and she's actually come up with original plans which were around 1889 from memory, where the council, where they've sold properties as strips of land, but they're clearly terraced properties, and then the council or the controlling authority has told them exactly how to dig them out, where to put and how to build the upper steps, and where to put the metal railings to guard the lower basement part of that. And this is a very clear example. It's not the same place, it's still London, but it shows exactly that kind of thing. So I will be linking the video to that because I think it's very interesting. And Kathy goes through the fact that I think it was 2000 or 2112 was the lot number of the property that she was reselling for a client or conveyancing or doing the solicitor's work for. But that also led to the question was that if that was and again I'm going too far, the property had been taken over by the Crown. So the Crown, or the King or Queen, the Crown Corporation of, had taken possession of vacant plots. So in Yarmouth there were over 2,000 vacant houses, and that leaves the big question of where did the population go. This is an iconic one from France. As you can see, this is the street level, and we have huge amounts of levels underneath. And this has been dug out for new construction work, but you can clearly see that there would have been some kind of life going on here, and that was never ever part of the original level of these buildings. And we have the same again from a different angle. You can just see how vast and how far these buildings go down. And what we get in history is we tend to have cataclysms, and then we build on top of, and then we build on top of. So for example, this may well have been a building that's been bricked up because of the mud flood or cataclysm. This is now the new level, and what they've done is this is probably was original, and what they've done at the top here, as you can see, it's a different coloured brick. They've probably added on another 2 stories just to make the house look, or the property look, more in line and keeping with all around. And it's probably likely that we have the same thing here. It's something that I've noticed a lot in buildings. Now this is a really interesting picture from 1871, photograph. And again, a lot of the properties we see being dug out or repurposed are around the mid 1860s all the way through till the 1900s. But this is 2nd and 3rd Street. I think it could be Delaware or somewhere like that, or Chicago, I'm not quite sure. But what we can see is the gentleman sitting here, and we have the top of a roof of a building. And look at all this material above. So he's actually looking down into the roof of a building that has been completely covered by mud. We can also see the brick building here going down that they've dug out on the right hand side. This is quite a famous picture. Again, 1880. It's a flour mill, and as you can see, this is their entrance in and out of the flour mill. Now we have this amazing building, and we have that as the entrance, and that just doesn't, to me, look as if it's the right kind of thing. It's Heath Robinson, as we would call it. And we have this huge amount of material sat here. And here we go again. This is Delaware, looking south from 3rd Street, and you can see the amount of mud that's built up, and these are crews or people digging the buildings out. And here we have a building that's not been dug out yet, and we still have lots of material around it. And so this would have been the level of the properties before they started digging out of, and it makes me wonder how many levels are below these properties as well. Again, I should imagine this is Delaware still, I'm not sure, but we can see that only the top of this building was available to be seen, and the rest of it has been covered in mud. And we have the similar thing here, where we have the top of a building sticking out of what is clearly a mud bank. And this photograph is dated 1868. This is typically what I think a mud flood after event would look like. The roads are just mud, and here we can see the chaos of life moving along in America with horse and cart, trying to get through a well populated area, which is probably one of the few areas that was able to be populated and some kind of trade and such like going on. And as these people wanted to expand and get out of such a foul area, we only really have the pavements that are of decent quality. That's when they would have been digging more and more properties out and getting the Freemasonry. So isn't that interesting that we have Freemasons And where did we get the name, I wonder? I wonder if we got it from the fact that there was a lot of people who died during the mud floods. And so what we actually see is that a organised Masonic group who were businessmen, politicians, etc., would have had the money and the nous and the ability to get something going and claim these buildings for themselves. Obviously in the UK, the Crown did a pretty good job of that. But in America, I should imagine that it was probably less federal and more local. And the Freemasons certainly would have taken the Freemasonry and then used that for their own purposes and sold them on potentially, or took over the really, really big important buildings for themselves. Here what we're observing is a steam-powered digger digging out mud from properties as it's going along. Again, this shows a train track and mud and devastation everywhere. Another one of my theories is that the train tracks that were supposedly laid across America and the UK and such like weren't laid. They were dug out. They were already there, and the mud covered them. And this is what they got the navvies over to do, and the Chinese, was to dig them out so they could repurpose it. I think they obviously repaired tracks and put new wood down, but fundamentally the system was there, the structure was there. And here we have a railway track going through with the big buildings, and you can see a steam powered digger digging out and digging these buildings out. You can see the height of the mud there is to the top of this building, which almost looks like a church. So you can see how much they've dug out. And isn't it interesting that we have the men in black suits with their hats overseeing the digging out of their buildings. This is very interesting. This is Naples. And what we also observe is building dates changing. So this date equals 890, and this date has been changed, and they've added an extra couple of numbers or numerals to get to 1890. And I should imagine 1890 is the time that this building was repurposed and taken over via the Freemasonry, or whichever person or group took it back over. And they would have changed the date to 1890, not because they're being nefarious and throwing people off. It's just that is the point in which that building was taken back over of their control, and so they wanted to put the date on the building of when it was reused again and taken over. And I think we see this a lot in houses and properties where the deeds will say 1880, 1890, 1870, 1850. And actually that's not. That's just only when the buildings had been dug out or reclaimed and resold, and a new date put on to hide the mud flood from the masses. Because let's be fair, the school and the official narrative will never ever tell you and talk about mud floods, and yet it's very clear that they were a thing. And there we go, that's the end of the slideshow, and I will go back to me. Hello. So yeah, I've tried to keep it fairly light and quick-ish, but we can clearly see that around the world in the late 1800s that properties were being reclaimed out of the mud and reused again to the same specification or same kind of way as we do today. Now we going on to a link onto Tartaria is a lot of these buildings we would class as Tartarian, and this is a name that's been given, a generalization of a name, because we don't know who built these. I will go into, I did some research a few years ago, and I've actually one of the few things I took notes on, and I will go into Australia and Sydney and a few other places. There's a place in Florida that I looked at as well, and I will show you some photographs or buildings and the population, and show you that the official narrative could not have been how it was. So we're being fed a false narrative on virtually everything in our lives, including what we live in and around in our cities. So we give all these buildings, like I said, an overview name of Tartaria. Now, I believe Tartaria likely started in around 1216, and I have seen a document where Tartaria was officially wound up in 1776. I have got that document photographed somewhere, but I think it's on an older computer, an older phone, and I haven't sparked them up yet and looked. But I have done a lot of research on this subject, and I think the next step would be the basic guide to, and a beginner's guide or look into Tartaria, and just how far across this realm, around this world, if you want to call it a world, that we have the Tartarian buildings and influence, and how they've been hidden, certainly in China and such like. And that then leads on to something else, which is free wireless electricity, and design of these buildings, and how important they were for us and our health. The previous video I've just done, I looked at the timeline split, and I did mention briefly something called Metatron's cube, and it appears that we have currently got sorry, my t-shirt, I'll get moaned at by the missus. We currently have square buildings, non-natural buildings. We've moved away from rounded, beautiful architecture that was beneficial to us, to square, dull cubes, and that's not by mistake. And it will be also something else I will be going into in the future. There's so much to cover, but to keep this video light, because I'm now babbling, and I do apologise, that's basically mud floods. It's mudlic refraction. Vibrational frequency causes the earth to rise as such, and it could also be where we get the term the rising dead, the living dead as such coming up. Because if you can imagine, if you've just buried a coffin under the ground and you get mudlic refraction, there's a good chance that coffin, being full of air and quite light and like a little boat or submarine, could pop up to the surface, and that could be quite a frightening thing to have the dead raising. I've got no evidence of that, but it's always an image that struck in my mind of, I wonder if that did happen. So yeah, mudlic refraction and volcanic ash covering the area, and probably and almost certainly huge losses of life. And that also then ties into orphan trains and incubators and such like, which is again all part of the Tartarian theme, which then goes into the great exhibitions in the late 1800s. So thank you very much for listening and watching, and I hope you enjoyed that presentation. It's just a brief guide to understanding what a mud flood is, and observing as you walk around looking for mud flooded buildings and understanding exactly what you're actually looking at. So blessings and thank you very much. Bye everyone. Bye.